Thank you, Dr. Moore. And thank you also for the invitation to be here for this series. When Casey approached me about doing this, he said, well, most of the speakers are going to be talking about their favorite psalm, but if you would like to and would be willing to do so, would you talk about archaeology and the book of Psalms? That's like asking a duck, does it like water? And so I readily agreed, although I have to admit, this is the kind of lecture I've never really done before. So this is sort of a new arena for me to work in. I deal mainly with the historical books and some of the historical aspects of the prophetic books. But one of the things that's important as we go into this discussion this evening is for you to understand what archaeology is all about now. Now, there was a period in time when archaeology was get the goodies for the museums and the estates and the rich people's collections kind of stuff. And we moved beyond that to a point where archaeology was descriptive of what people did. But we now are in an arena of trying to explain why people did what they did and how what they did plays out in the material remains that we find in the archaeological record. Now, that said, archaeology is a subset of anthropology. Now, I realize to a lot of people, as soon as you mention anthropology, it's like, get away from me, I don't want anything to do with that. But in a very literal sense, anthropology is the study of humanity. And it's the study of everything, essentially, that people have done. And as far as archaeology is concerned, things that people have left behind. But a lot of what we find is very fragmentary because so much of what people have had in the past, as well as what we have today, is not preserved. So we have sort of a fraction amount of material with which to work. So it's important to look at the contexts within which the events and the lives of the people of antiquity occurred. And that being said, it's important to look at geography and topography. This is actually part of archaeology now. Admittedly, this is not necessarily something that people have left behind, but it often molds the way people think and things that they do and the interactions that they have to one degree or another with each other. Now, when it comes to the Psalter, or the pepper, when it comes to the Psalter, archaeology has had not quite the kind of impact that we would normally think in terms of. It's not been primarily through buildings or architectural features or monuments or cities or artifacts. Now, having said that, there are quite a number of these things that will play into and do play into our understanding of what's going on in the Psalms. But the discoveries of archaeology have had more to do from our discovery of texts and giving us some insights into language, into literary styles, and to poetic formats and ideas that characterize the people in antiquity. We have a tendency many times to think in terms of the children of Israel as living in sort of an isolated enclave with relatively little influence from other sources. I think most of us, when we really stop and think about it, realize the placement of Israel in the location where it is. There is a much larger context within which they are living. Israel was not isolated at all from other cultures. To the contrary, a lot of other cultures had significant impact in what the people did and their thinking and so forth. And as far as that larger context is concerned, we certainly can think in terms of Egypt, we can think in terms of Mesopotamia, and of course even the Canaanites. And you might mention the Hittites. And moving into the New Testament period, you would think in terms of the Greeks and the Romans and so forth. All of these cultures have some impact in what's going on. Now, admittedly, the Greeks and the Romans don't have much to do with the Psalms. But these other cultures do. And I'm not going to try to do a comprehensive discussion of this at all because it's much too large for me to deal with in the limited time that is involved here. And frankly, I don't know all the stuff that it has impact with. But when we think in terms of the Egyptian connections, we will not deal in depth with all of this. Just look at the kind of list of Israel's and the precursors of Israel, Abraham, for instance, in their connections to the Egyptian world. Abraham, as soon as he comes into the land of Canaan, summoned by God to leave Haran, there's a famine, so he goes into the land of Egypt. Joseph eventually, of course, is going to be sold into Egypt, and he is the means through whom God is going to prepare the scene and the bed for the children of Israel, the sons of Jacob, to come in to escape the famine. And they're there for hundreds of years. And there has to be some element of cultural impact that takes place. Of course, Israel then is delivered from bondage according to the book of Exodus. And then Solomon later, skipping a couple of hundred years later at least, Solomon marries an Egyptian woman. And one wonders how much impact does she have in what he might say or how he phrases things. Solomon has extensive trades with Egypt and cities and countries to the north. Jeroboam, when he is getting away from Solomon, flees to the land of Egypt. And of course, then when he comes back, some of that Egyptian motif probably is still in his psyche, if you will, as he becomes king of the northern kingdom of Israel. Shishak eventually is going to invade not only Judah, but also Israel, and the monument in Egypt that preserves a list of the towns that Shishak will conquer. And of course, then eventually you're going to have the Judahites that are going to flee to Egypt, getting away from the Babylonians. And they force Jeremiah even to go with them. So there's a lot of, and this is only a brief survey of some of the larger Egyptian connections the children of Israel would have. But then we also have those Mesopotamian connections. It's interesting how many times we tend to forget that Abraham comes from the Mesopotamian world. He's born in Ur of the Chaldees, down relatively near the Persian Gulf, goes to Haran, then God approaches him in Haran and says, leave your family and your kindred and go to the land that I will show you. And so he brings with him some element of understanding of the Mesopotamian world. How much that influences the thinking or not is not totally clear. Isaac is going to get his wife Rebekah from Haran. Abraham engineers that. Jacob is going to run away and get his 2 wives and 2 concubines, if you will, from Haran. And eventually comes back. Eventually the Assyrians are going to invade from the north, and they're going to conquer Israel and at least significant components of Judah. And then eventually, of course, the Babylonians are going to come and capture and take Judah into captivity. And Daniel and Ezekiel both are going to be taken to Babylon. And of course, the book of Esther is set within the Mesopotamian world as she is in the Persian world. Now, again, this is just sort of a very quick survey of the interconnections that ancient Israel would have had with the Mesopotamian world. And then you think in terms of the Canaanite connections. And this, of course, is going to become extremely problematic for the children of Israel as the story unfolds. The land, of course, is given to the Israelites, promised to them to Abraham in Genesis chapter 17. And it is the land from which Israel did not expel all the people. Joshua chapter 23, Joshua is reminding the children of Israel of the fact that they've not fully accomplished the task that God has in mind. And he says in verses 12 and 13, for if you turn back, and listen carefully to this, if you turn back and cling to the remnant of these nations remaining among you, and make marriages with them so that you associate with them and they with you, know for certain that the Lord your God will no longer drive out these nations before you, but they will be a snare and a trap for you, a whip on your sides and thorns in your eyes until you perish from off this good land which the Lord has given you. Of course, the book of Judges is replete with all kinds of examples of the Canaanite impact that has occurred upon the religious expressions and devotions of the children of Israel. They begin to intermarry with non-Israelite people. Samson, of course, is notable in this when we look at the book of Judges. And then Solomon, in 1 Kings chapter 11, one of the notable things about Solomon is the Bible emphasizes that his many wives are the ones who turned away his heart from serving the Lord. And so those foreign wives become elements that impact this. And Solomon, here's a guy to whom a lot of the literature is attributed when we think in terms of the Old Testament connections. Admittedly, Syria and Palestine, and I use Syria-Palestine here not in any modern political sense. Syro-Palestine is a land bridge between Asia and Africa and Europe. Now, when we think in terms of, let me get this, I'm going to point on this one over here. Asia is this area, Africa, of course, here, and we don't normally think in terms of Europe as being significant, but the typical trading routes would go along and hug along the coast. I'm not going to address recent finds that have been discovered that find ships out in the middle of the ocean. That's another ballgame. But typically, the trade routes would hug along the coast, and they would move and end up over here in Europe, as well as the physical land travel. Now, as we think in terms of how this unfolds, and we look at the location of Israel, this is a large representation of roughly where ancient Israel is situated. Look at and I affectionately refer to this as the foreigners tromping through the land. We look at the Egyptians. This is before Israel occupies the land, but Egyptians are going to go through here, fighting against the Hittites up north. Then eventually you're going to have the Syrians come along, and they're going to at least menace the northern kingdom significantly under Hazael and Ben-Hadad in the books of Kings. Then you're going to have the Assyrians that are going to make their way. And it's interesting, in the book of Jeremiah, if you've read this very carefully, Jeremiah will talk in terms about the people coming from the north. And it's interesting how many of the peoples come from the north. Even though their place of origin is significantly east of Israel, because of the Fertile Crescent and the barrier of the desert, they inevitably will make that route over the northern Fertile Crescent and make their way southward. The Assyrians are going to do it. The Babylonians are going to do it as they make their way eventually down into Egypt as well. And then eventually you're going to have the Greeks come along and conquer the area. I skipped the Persians, sorry about that. They did the same thing. And then you have the Romans that are going to come along and make their way southward as well as branch off in different directions. All of these nations are tromping through the land of Canaan, the land of Israel. And you have to recognize that a lot of them are strong political entities. They're going to leave an imprint on the way people express themselves. This is very characteristic of a multicultural, multi-ethnic kind of community. And Israel is certainly elements of that as we think in terms of how it unfolds. Comparative literary contexts of Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Canaan eventually were lost. Matter of fact, we can describe it as they became dead civilizations. And our unfolding and insight into the surrounding cultures are only fairly recent understandings in academic perspectives. Because to a large extent, we couldn't do anything with it, because they were dead cultures and the civilization and the literature was lost. The beginning of this, of course, and most all elementary school students can tell you something about the Egyptians and so forth. For fourth grade, I think, is sort of the big year that they really get into that kind of stuff. Maybe not. Maybe it's earlier than that. But hieroglyphics before the decipherment of the language in 1822 by this scholar were basically just looked at. I mean, they knew it was a language, but it was looked at as, my, isn't that a nice decoration on the wall kind of thing. And if you look at hieroglyphics, a lot of them are really rather pretty, just because of the artistic character of them. What did they say? Until this decipherment in 1822, people didn't understand what it said. And so all of that Egyptian context was a total loss to biblical studies. And we could not tap into the comparative literature in the surrounding areas. Similar kind of situation holds true with Akkadian. In the mid-1800s, Austin Henry Layard begins excavating on the behalf of the British Museum at Kuyunjik, Nineveh, which is shown in the map on the left-hand side. And the French had already been excavating there, and they'd not found much anything of significance, so they go on somewhere else. And for whatever reason, Layard persuades the British Museum, let me go excavate there, and he finds fantastic discoveries. Here is a picture from the frontispiece of some of his excavation report. It wasn't an extremely well-done excavation, but then what would you expect in 1850? All right? Archaeology was more of a let's rush to get the goodies and fill the museums. And to a large extent, it was a big contest between the British and the French and the Germans to fill their museums. The British Museum, the Louvre, and the museum in Berlin. Matter of fact, the British give Layard 2,000 pounds. Now, if you have to understand in 1845, that was a lot of money. But they gave him 2,000 pounds to find as many museum pieces as possible as quickly as possible. I mean, we shudder when we think in terms of that kind of procedure today. But this was the goal of the English and the French and the Germans, and they sort of looked at the Middle East as a place to go treasure hunting. Now, admittedly, the ideas and attitudes have all changed, and fortunately, we have gotten past that. But one of the things that Layard discovered was Ashurbanipal's library. This was a huge discovery. For all practical purposes, Akkadian was not understood. There were some ventures into it. There were some ideas of perhaps how to understand it, but it wasn't really understood until Rawlinson comes along, and he actually sort of breaks all the code and everything else, similar to the Rosetta Stone, but from a different source over in Iran. And now they're able to read Akkadian. But it was not significantly deciphered until the mid-1850s. Now, think in terms of our chronology today. That's only like 175 years ago. I realize to all of us that sounds like a long time ago. But as far as academics is concerned, it's fairly recent. Plus the complicating factor of not everything was immediately translated. We'll come back to that in a moment. So the Epic of Gilgamesh, which most everybody is familiar with, which, by the way, we have a full-size reproduction, it's not that big. We have a full-size replica of this in the museum at Harding, commercial. If you have not gone to the Biblical Archaeology Museum at Harding, please do so. It's free. All I ask, sign the guest book. Okay, moving on. But I'll allude to several things there. But the Epic of Gilgamesh was not identified until 1872. It had sat in their storage facilities for 25 years before anybody identified what's going on here. And then Smith goes to Nineveh trying to find more of the tablets, and he found parts that joined to previous tablets that they discovered. Oh, that I would have such luck. My luck doesn't run that well. But anyway, but this is the situation that he encounters. Now, as far as the Canaanite world, we have another arena. In 1928, a farmer was plowing his field, and his plow got stuck on a rock. Now, this is a plow that is being pulled by a cow or a donkey. Okay, I don't know which. But anyway, the plow gets stuck on a rock, and he dislodges his plow from the rock, and moving the rock out of the way, he opens a tomb, which is about the distance from here to Main Street from a tell, maybe a little further distance than that. He reports this to the local authorities, who then come and recognize this fancy tomb that we've encountered. We're not talking about a mere grave, we're talking about a tomb, okay, an interior structure. And they come to the realization this must be associated with that site over there, and so they begin immediately to excavate. And the very first year of the excavation, they find its library. And it included Akkadian as well as some other languages that the scholars at the time knew, but it included another language that was unknown to us. And we now refer to this as Ugaritic, because of the site of Ugarit, situated at the end of the arrow on the right-hand picture of the map up there. And it's Canaanite. A lot of the material associated with Ugarit were tablets that express the mythologies and religious ideas and rituals of the Canaanite world. And this was essentially the first time Archaeologists and historians have had access to this outside of the pages of the Bible. And it opened a huge arena. The picture that you're looking at, while it looks like two pieces that are joined together and one of them reconstructed, a replica, and the other's original, actually both of them are original because they were found in two different places and someone recognized they're joined together. This is music notation from 1400 BC. And some scholars finally figured out how this sounds, and they have played it and so forth. And it's a fascinating, rather sort of mysterious kind of music to listen to, but nonetheless, this is some of the oldest, I'm not going to say it's the oldest, but some of the oldest musical notation that we have in existence. And it comes from the Canaanite world. But this did not come to light until after 1928. Some of the scholars, skeptical scholars, prior to this very significant discovery, had begun to argue that the references to Canaanite religion in the pages of the Old Testament are just, they're sort of hyperboles and exaggerations in order to make Yahweh look better. In other words, let's paint this dismal picture of the Canaanite religion in order to make the Lord look more magnificent. Only with the discoveries of these kinds of things to come to the realization that no, this is what was not an exaggerated description of Canaanite religion. To the contrary, we now recognize it's not as fully embellished as the Canaanite documents themselves are. It's somewhat mooted. Fascinating point. So 3 academic thresholds come into play in order to provide archaeological and literary insights into the Old Testament literature and the Psalms in particular. First one was in the 1820s with the Egyptian hieroglyphics. The second threshold would be in the 1850s for Mesopotamia and the discovery of the Akkadian materials. And then in the 1930s, after a couple of years of the decipherment for the Canaanite world. And obviously the one in the Canaanite world it's less than a century ago. Now here's the kicker. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of tablets and materials are still residing in museums that have never been translated. And one wonders, what additional information might come to light as one might go and look at this? So when we think in terms, this was a good example. This was an Akkadian document that was acquired by the British Museum in 1920. But nothing was really done with it until 2007. And there was discovered a reference to a character out of the book of Jeremiah referred to on it. I mean, it really makes you wonder, what is lurking in the storage facilities of the British Museum and the Louvre and other such locations where there are not the scholars to work and translate these things, and additional insights that we might have once these come to light. Imagination can just sort of run wild, but it needs to be restrained. One of the things that happens is, and scholars had already recognized this, but the poetic style of the Psalter in particular is laid out not like our poetry. I mean, we're talking Hebrew here. We're not talking about English. Our English poetry historically, traditionally, has had meter and rhyme and rhythm and all that kind of stuff, okay? Most of us remember when we first started learning to read poetry and so forth, and the rhyme was probably what most of us picked up on, but then we began to recognize the rhythm and meter and all that kind of stuff. Well, you cannot, if you've ever studied a foreign language, there is no such thing as a one word for one word translation. That doesn't work. It's essentially an impossibility. And secondly, in order to have rhyme always appear from one language into another is almost an impossibility. But what I find fascinating is the Lord appropriated, maybe I shouldn't use that phrase, but he used the poetic system of the time as a means by which to express himself and for his devotees to express themselves in a way that does not depend upon rhyme, but it depends upon the relationship of one line to the next line. Now, I'm going to give you 3 examples of this, and people who work in the Hebrew and the poetic areas will argue that there are more of them, but they're basically subsets of the 3 that we're going to look at. The first one we're going to consider is the idea of a synonymous parallelism. Now, if you know anything about English, which I hope you do, synonym means it's the same thing, okay? But it's a different word and so forth. So synonymous parallelism is where you have one line says something and the second line essentially says the same thing in different words. All right? Which basically means, being a poetic structure, it is very important that we not come at this and look at it in a very legalistic sense and say, this says this word here and this word here, therefore there must be some fine differentiation between this, and make doctrinal extensions off of that. This ignores and overlooks the poetic structure that is there. And we need to respect the poetry. We need to see the forest and not just the trees, okay? So this is sort of the idea under consideration here. The second category is progressive or synthetic parallelism, where the first line will say something and the second line may overlap this a bit, but it extends the idea into another area, sort of a continuation of the thought. It's not a repetition, although part of it might be repetition, but it continues the thought into a different direction so that it fulfills additional expressions. I'll give you some examples of this in a moment. And then there's the antithetic parallelism, where you have the first line that says something and the second one sort of expresses the opposite of it. Oftentimes, not always, oftentimes the second line begins with but. You know, da, 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 but, and usually that's a clue that you're looking at an antithetic parallelism. But not all antithetic parallelisms will do this. Okay, let me give you some examples of this. Now, in the Ugaritic world, by the way, the Ugaritic literature predates the establishment of the monarchy. All right, so we're looking at something that was already in existence before the children of Israel get on the scene. And in this Ugaritic example of parallelism, you're going to see some synonymous parallelism and then a progressive parallelism. Now in this, the divine waters, who are 2 gods known as Yamu and Naharu. Yamu is the sea and Naharu is the rivers, okay, Nahar. And they approach El, who is the chief deity. And this is Canaanite mythology, by the way. So they approach El, who is the father of Baal, and they demand that Baal submits to them and pay tribute to them. So this is the setting of the scene. But I want you to listen to how this unfolds here. The bull, which is a reference to El, his father El replies, Baal is your servant, O Yamu. Baal is your servant, O Naharu. Now, Yamu and Naharu are basically in collusion here. They're the water gods, if you will. The son of Dagon, who is a reference to Baal, is your prisoner. Now notice the synonym aspect. All 3 of these lines are basically saying the same thing. He will indeed bring you tribute. Like one of the gods, he will bring you a gift. Like one of the sons of the Holy One, he will bring you presents. Now, again, our Western meticulous way of thinking might come along and argue each of these phrases has some different nuance to direction and so forth. No, don't do that. You know, get the feel for it. And that's often how poetry functions, is getting the feel for it. Now, when we think in terms of some parallelisms in the Bible, and there are all kinds of them there. I mean, there's numerous examples. But here, the kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together. Psalm 2:2. Well, these 2 lines are essentially saying the same thing. Kings and rulers are the same critters. Set themselves and take counsel are parallel expressions. They're not talking about 2 different enterprises and activities under consideration. They're talking about the same kind of thing. So these are synonymous parallelisms. Interestingly, in this verse, as we define verses, it continues with a synthetic, because the third line is going to continue the thought. So we look at the kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together, and against the Lord and against his anointed. So the first 2 lines are talking about their conspiracies against God. And of course, Sad part about it is this is the way so much of the world functions. It's not a unique idea. We're still wrestled with this reality when we look at our world today. An antithetic parallelism, a good example is Proverbs chapter 12. Lying lips are an abomination to the Lord, but, notice how it begins it, but those who act faithfully are his delight. So abomination and his delight are opposites here. And so you have this contrast, this antithesis that is set up. Now these are very common kinds of expressions that characterize the Psalter. There are also alphabetic acrostics. Now, all of you, I'm sure, have run into this. I remember when I was a youngster sitting in church, bored to tears with my dad's sermon, I would rummage through the Bible looking for those pages where all the pages are red. Notice I wasn't the most devoted listener. And then those pages, 2 or 3 pages where there are only 2 or 3 red letter words. Acts 20 is one of them, more blessed to give than to receive. I mean, that's only red there is on that page. And finding the shortest chapter in the Bible and the longest chapter in the Bible. The longest one is the one that most people are intrigued by because it is an acrostic poem. Now, this is the Hebrew. I don't expect any of you to read this, perhaps 1 or 2 of you. I don't know your educational background. But Hebrew reads from right to left. And so over here you have the 119th Psalm, and there's that squiggly thing that looks like an X. Your English Bibles will probably say Aleph in front of verse 1. And then if you scan down after verse 8, between verse 8 and 9, it'll have Beth, as most people would pronounce it, but that's a mispronunciation. It's Bait. And then between verses 16 and 17, there would be Gimel. And then between, every 8 verses, there's going to be one of these letters. And each of those letters is a sequential letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, Vav, Zayin, Chet, Tet, and so forth down the line. Okay, just like we would say A, B, C, D, E. Same kind of thing. So as you look at this, you can see, whether you can read it or not, you can see each of these lines, verse 1, verse 2, verse 3, verse 4, verse 5, each of them begins with that thing that looks like an X. That's not an X, that's an Aleph. And it continues up here, 6, 7, and 8. The next line, there is the Bait section, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. All of them begin with a Bait. And then the next line, Gimel, all of them begin with the G sound. And then you have the next sequence of 8, all of them beginning with the D sound, the Dalet, and so forth. So you have 176 verses, all divided up into 22 clusters, all of which begin with the same letter in a sequential sequence of the alphabet. And if you've ever read Psalm 119, it hangs together. And by the way, like English, there are some Hebrew letters of the alphabet that don't have a lot of words associated with that letter, like Q and Y and Z are in English. If you look in your dictionaries, the Q and X and Z sections are pretty thin relative to everything else. Well, Hebrew suffers with the same problem. And yet all of this works together. I mean, it's a creative dedication to the law and the Word of God. And the whole thing is an exaltation of the wonders of God's Word and His law and His guidance. It is not the kind of chagrin that a lot of people express about, law, rules, regulations. No, this recognizes the value of these for us as human beings. Now, the rest of the world also had acrostics. Here is an interesting one. By the way, acrostics, we use these also oftentimes in outlines, LOVE, love, life, O, others, so forth and so on. And that kind of thing. Joy, Jesus, others, and yourself. Okay, those are acrostics. But here's one that is not an alphabetic acrostic, but it's an acrostic out of the Akkadian world that talks about Ashurbanipal. And the first letter of each section forms the sentence to read, I am Ashurbanipal who calls on you, give me life, Marduk, I will glorify you. Don't ask me to read it, I don't know Akkadian. I'm trusting the scholars on this one. All right, shifting gears. One of the things that has happened particularly with the discovery of the Ugaritic materials, is the recognition in a very dramatic way of the conflict between Baal and Yahweh, the Bible versus Canaan. Baal was the god of storms, rain, thunder, lightning, snow, mist, clouds, all of that stuff that comes from the sky that we rely upon for the growth of our crops and everything else. This is a statue of him from the site of Ugarit, stands about this tall. And I'm sure there were other bigger ones in the ancient world, but this is all that's preserved. And he's standing there with his right hand raised, and he would have had a stick or something in here as a bolt of lightning ready to throw it down to the earth, because that's the kind of domain within which he ruled. Now, when we think in terms of the storyline again, Baal in this narrative is wanting to build a palace. But El has to give permission in order for that to happen. But he's reticent to go to El, thinking that El isn't going to intercede for him. So he gets Mom, Asherah, to come with him to approach El for permission to build a temple. This is really weird, okay? I mean, this gives us some insight into the Canaanite world and the mythology. So this is how it is unfolding. The first two lines is basically Baal asking for the permission in the presence of El. Let a house be built for Baal like the other gods' houses, a court like the courts of the sons of Asherah, the rest of his brothers. So then Lady Asherah intercedes, and she apparently approaches El with this request. Great indeed, El, is your wisdom. Your gray beard surely instructs you. The respite that is yours alone surely instructs you. For now, or when he gets his palace, for now Baal can send his rain in due season, send the season of driving showers, and Baal can shout aloud in the clouds, that's the thunder in part, and his lightning bolts he can cast to the earth. So this is a domain in which Baal works. Well, I want you to consider Psalm 29. The voice of the Lord is over the waters. Now, this is the Lord, Yahweh. The voice of the Lord is over the waters. The God of glory thunders. The Lord over many waters. The voice of the Lord is powerful. The voice of the Lord is full of majesty. The voice of the Lord breaks the cedars. The Lord breaks the cedars of Lebanon, and he makes Lebanon to skip like a calf. And Sirion, which is Mount Hermon, like a young wild ox. This is alluding to earthquakes. The voice of the Lord flashes forth flames of fire. The voice of the Lord shakes the wilderness. The voice shakes the wilderness of Kadesh. The Lord sits enthroned over the flood. The Lord sits enthroned as king forever. Well, when you understand the mindset of the Canaanites, and you hear this psalm, you suddenly come to the realization this is a polemic. This is a psalm that is addressing a pagan mindset and recognizing that your understanding of how all of this works is misguided, because it is not Baal who does it, it is Yahweh who is in charge of all of this. Yahweh had already shown his control of these matters when you look at the episode in Mount Sinai in Exodus chapter 19, and you have the evidence of cloud and thunder and lightning and earthquakes all involved in God's manifestation to Israel. His power over the waters has already been demonstrated through the passing through of the Red Sea and dry ground, and the provision of water on at least one episode already. Yahweh is the one who's in charge of this. It continues when we think in terms of Baal was worshipped already in Canaan, already in that location. Baal of Peor, the episode with Balaam that unfolds here. Baal of Ashdod, this is a picture of Baal and his representation at the site of Ashdod. And here is a representation of Baal as a bull, as a calf at Chatzor that was found in the excavations. Again, when we think in terms of this, Israel is lured, back to the negligence of Israel to do what they should be doing, is lured into Baal worship at Baal of Peor. This is the episode where Thousands of Israelites are killed, and Phinehas comes along and redeems them. Gideon is told to tear down the altar to Baal, which makes you wonder why in the world is his dad worshiping Baal, but that's another ball game. Pardon the pun. This is a bronze calf that was found in the area of Manasseh, and I have a replica of it here. This is the size that it was. Discovered in 1977. Israelite territory. When we think in terms of this theological polemic, this Psalm 29 is a verbal theological polemic, an argument against their understanding of Baal. The episode of Elijah on Mount Carmel is a practical demonstration of God's power over the elements. For 3 years it was not rained. And they come on top of Carmel and they build these altars to the respective gods. Baal is supposed to be sending rain, but hasn't for 3 years and can't even ignite this sacrifice. But Yahweh sends fire from heaven, lightning, sends fire from heaven and ignites the sacrifice. And right after that, they go to Carmel and Elijah says, there's a sound of a storm coming. James, of course, will refer to the power of Elijah's prayer. When you think in terms of Psalm 29, I want to play here this song, a rendition that is produced by Lynn Reeves, a graduate of Harding, where he sings all of the parts. But I want you to hear the power of the song. Because this is the kind of thing that Psalms is supposed to implant within the hearts of people. The lightning.
The voice of the Lord is over the waters. The God of all glory thunders. The voice of the Lord is filled with power. The voice of the Lord is majestic. The voice of the Lord breaks the cedars of Lebanon. He makes her skip like a calf. The voice of the Lord strikes with flashes of lightning. It shakes the desert sand. Oh, listen and hear as the silence is shattered. With all of creation rejoice. Oh, listen and hear, for one day all the nations will bow at the sound of his voice. The voice of the Lord is over the waters. The God of all glory thunders. The voice of the Lord is filled with power. The voice of the Lord is majestic. The voice of the Lord breaks the cedars of Lebanon. He makes her skip like a calf. The voice of the Lord strikes with flashes of lightning. It shakes the desert sand. Oh, listen and hear as the silence is shattered. With all of creation rejoice. Oh, listen and hear, for one day all the nations will bow at the sound of his voice. Oh, listen and hear as the silence is shattered. With all of creation rejoice. Oh, listen and hear, for one day all the nations will bow at the sound of his voice.
I don't know about you, but I get goosebumps every time I hear this. And when we understand, I mean, the song itself says a lot, but when we understand the contrast, it just jumps out with such power and might. According to my watch, I'm out of time. And I'm not going to burden you with the rest of the lecture. But I do want to close with some observations. Go ahead and shut off the PowerPoint if you would. God, the people of God grew out of a context of international influence. And God communicates with them and with us, going from the known to the unknown, from things with which we are familiar, and He will retool and recast those with different meanings and emphases. And as an archaeologist, I can affirm, at least in my mind and my soul and spirit, the more we understand about the world of antiquity out of which the Bible comes, the richer and more powerful the message is as we think in terms of its application to us today. I thank you so much for your kind attention.
Worship you.